Well, we're back talking with Andrew Hurd about his new book, Growth and Change. And Andrew, in the last episode, we spent a lot of time talking about numbers and output thinking. Does this put more pressure on the pastor, especially if the numbers are going in the wrong direction?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, yeah. The more you care about making a difference, the more you care about seeing things change, the more your life will be bound up with what happens with people. But what I notice is that that's the Apostle Paul. I think one of the places that first twigged for me with this was Paul says to the Thessalonians, "Now I live knowing that you're standing firm in the faith." And that is so not psychologically healthy. Do you know what I mean? Like, I remember hearing people tell me that, no, you need to create professional distance. You know, you ought not be. You ought to be able to do what you do and not be bound up with what's happening with the person. But then I go, hang on, that wasn't Paul. Maybe he just lived too early and he needed to have been matured by our psychological insights and helped. Maybe he was just immature.
And is there a difference between being deeply concerned for people in your congregations versus finding your identity in how they're going?
Well, tease that out. Where Paul says, "Now I live," right, knowing that you're standing firm. Where does that become unhealthy in our cultural context? Is it just that we have misread the issues of relationships and how they work? What are you picking up? Joe, what do you think?
This is not an interview with me, it's an interview with you.
But you give us your thought, because I think you'll be good.
Yeah, I actually don't know the answer to that, because I think that what you're talking about in terms of Paul's writing, it's a very deep concern for people. So it's not just a nice, I'm glad that they're going well. He's actually concerned about the congregations that he's planted. But then if it becomes that your sense of yourself, your sense of who you are is actually rooted in the success of that ministry or how people are going rather than Jesus, then that's really problematic. Paul Tripp raises that in terms of, if you're going to find your identity and your worth in your ministry, you're going to have a very miserable existence. I guess the question is, what's at the centre of who you see yourself in ministry, and are you putting those things like measurements and how people are going into that centre where Jesus should only be? I guess that would be my question.
Yeah, that's helpful. I'd echo the thought that it's complex. And I think we can reduce it down to people need to reduce things down to simple messages and so on and so forth. But one of the challenges is God himself grieves over his people. Jesus weeps over Jerusalem. Paul cannot continue on in his ministry because of the anxiety he has for what's happening. So he has to send someone. He has sleepless nights. Now, that all sounds to me like someone who has at their centre something other than Jesus. The question you wrestle with is, when does it become inappropriately bound up? And when is it a natural expression of a loving person who's connected with what's going on? So my kids aren't walking in the faith, wonderfully they are, but my children aren't walking with Christ, I grieve over that, and my life, it's on my mind. I can't just get on and be. A mother's lost a child, a miscarriage. You can't just say Jesus at the centre. Don't be brought down by that, because it's part of a deep connection and relationship that's going to impact me in my emotions, my psychology. I would offer that where it's problematic is when when it spirals for you. You can't actually get out of the spiral and find the moment of rest and comfort in the sovereign care of a Father who's in control of all things. So I think other than that, it's hard to get the particular recipe to get it right and wrong. Because my identity, there is a sense in which as a pastor, my identity is bound up with the well-being of the people I pastor. Now, if I mean by that my worth as a human depends on what the numbers are. That's gone too far. Of course, there's an issue there. But as a parent, the well-being of my children that's so much part of my life and my identity and my being.
And I guess if you're not feeling that concern, then it would go back to those gospel convictions. Do we have those deep convictions about the lost and the brevity of this life and how we're spending our time?
Yes.
If that concern is not being shown for people and their lostness or their growth in Christ, then what's happening convictionally for us?
Yes, actually, and Sid, thank you, Jade. This is where I think of where my reaction's coming from. Is I'm very sensitive to the things that that cut the nerve of passionate, energetic Christian ministry. And so when I hear people talk about your identity and these kinds of things, I agree. I think I talk about these things too. I think there are issues there, the me project. But my fear sometimes is that we pursue psychological health sometimes at the expense of the kind of New Testament connection between pastor and people. And I want us to be alert to, I guess that's what I want to push back and say, no, I want you to be like Paul, who feels so entwined with his people, that their ups are your ups, their downs are your downs, you weep with and you rejoice with. And so I've pushed back a little bit on the comment, if you're entwined like that, you'll have a miserable life. And I think, well, isn't that our calling? Do you mean like, weren't we called? I die that you might live. Yeah. Isn't that our calling? Now, I get it. That also triggers the psychological issues of I can't get out of the spiral. My worth is bad. There's issues there, no, undoubtedly. But that's why I push back against the soil issue. Because I hear too often the soil issues used to cut the nerve of self-examination, self-reflection,
responsibility,
drive, energy, pursue. There's certainly true things in all of these observations, but we need to watch what they push back and do to us all.
How do you think, in talking about those things, how do you think a pastor should address like the urgency of proclaiming the gospel, getting things done before Jesus' return, with that of running a long race and persevering in ministry? People raise the question of burnout. How do those things work together?
Oh, wow. Again, these are complex matters. So that burnout is not just working hard. So burnout's not just a consequence of doing too many hours. There is a kind of burnout that's just tiredness, and the solution to that is get a holiday, and you'll come back refreshed. But there is a kind of psychological burnout, if I dare move into this space as an amateur. There is a kind of psychological burnout that's more debilitating, that's not just resolved by change of hours, change of context and so on. There's something you're bringing to the context that's interacting and feeding with the context. And so, the challenge for Christians is that we are quite rightly, appropriately people of love. So when we see someone being hurt in the activity ministry, we've got a very great sensitivity to doing everything we can to remove the thing that might hurt. And I think the secular world's concerned about burnout. We are most concerned about it because we're people of love. But we've got to pay attention to that in the context of a love for the lost and a love for the immature and a love for the fringe, where Jesus did not live a balanced, flourishing life. He didn't add his Christian ministry into a richly orbed web of all the different things he does to make sure his life is as full and as rich as possible, and does Christian ministry, but not too much so that he doesn't burn out. He did get taken to the cross, and the Apostle Paul, the apostles, they poured themselves out like a drink offering. So there's a whole dimension there that we need to pay attention to, whilst being aware of the issues we can bring into our ministries that predispose us to a psychological burnout issue.
Yeah.
But I do worry about a culture in recent times where the first question candidates for ministry are asking is, how will this affect my health? What are the boundaries? What will it do for my family? Now, they're important questions, but in our culture, they become the first ones.
Yeah. And I guess on the other extreme is asking the question of, we want people to stay in ministry for the long term. It takes years to develop someone, for them to mature, to be equipped for ministry. So asking that question of how do we sustain people in ministry over the long term, considering those challenges of ministry, or even what sustained you over the long term in ministry?
Yeah, again, I have this. If you begin with the thought, how do we sustain ourselves? That can predispose us to a cultural blind spot, which is, how can I make sure my life's okay? But the way you've couched it is helpful in terms of, how do I sustain myself for the sake of serving the cause of the gospel most effectively for the longest time?
Yeah.
And that's an important piece to mention. I just want to watch that other one, because sometimes the most helpful thing for our churches is not that we sustain ourselves for the long term, but they see us modelling a life of working hard for them, where they go, look, you need to take a break. There's a sense in which what I want is a pastoral team where the congregation's saying, we need you to take a holiday. Whereas I think what we can tend towards is, we want a pastoral team that models the balanced Christian life, where they are flourishing and enjoying and loving serving, and it's a beautiful thing. And all we do then is cultivate a congregational experience where they think pursuing the beautiful life's the end. But again, I don't read that off the pages of the New Testament, except all good things are created for our enjoyment. Sabbath rest is a good thing. So there's some, of course, pieces there that we need to pay attention to. But there's a number of pushes back and forward. I'm particularly wanting to push into one side of thing, appreciating my brothers and sisters who push the other one as well. I think together we need to wrestle with it.
So two things there. There's a need for self-awareness.
Yeah, good.
So there's a need to sort of understand yourself and who you are.
Good.
I'm not you. You're not me. We're in a different context.
Yep.
But there is also a reality that as human beings we need rest. We're not God. So you do spend a bit of time in the book pushing into rest and thinking about rest.
Yeah. There's a number of reasons why we need to rest. One is the refreshment and the sustainability. The other is that I'm not God. So there's a sense in which taking a day off at least a week helps impress upon me that I'm not indispensable. The world, I don't make the world turn. So that's a really healthy lens. I trust God for this people, and I can take a day out from it. The other reason is, of course, to anticipate the rest to come. So my day off is a way of anticipating the new creation and the hope that I have there. So there's a number of reasons to pay attention to rest, of course. So the self-awareness piece is you're exactly right. We had a conversation here with some of our trainees, and I had a wonderful time with a couple of the women that are doing our trainee program, and they're second, third year into this time with us. The first year was they were just overwhelmed and thinking this is unhealthy, but then the second year they said, we're finding we can work harder than we did before. And we're starting to work out what triggers us and what are the things that undo us when the pressure comes on. So they will learn. What was happening was, in the context of an increased demand on their life, they were forced, this is their reflection, they were forced to actually start to pay attention to who they were, how they best functioned, what rests they do need, what things they need to pay attention to. Now that is, and the other thing they observed was they're becoming more resilient by pushing themselves to the edge and coming back. And I thought, wow, this is genius. And that doesn't happen if you enter into the work thinking I've got 45 hours and I'm just going to stick to that. But as you are drawn out into the stretch, you do learn. I've got particular limits that are different to someone else's limits. That are, I was talking to Peter Jensen the other day in a small group about it, and we raised some of these issues. And he said at the age of 80, he's still doing 50-hour weeks. Now, I'm not Peter. I don't know. I'll be on a beach when I'm 80, I think. But and he didn't say it. He just said, look, I'm still pressing on like that. And the nature of what he does in those 50 hours won't be necessarily the same as someone else's 50 hours. But nonetheless, people are different. We need to pay attention to that and know who you are.
And you've talked about self-awareness, so each person will be different. Any insights you can share from doing ministry over a number of years of things that you put into your week or into your day of rest that you found helpful?
Yeah. A couple of little things. Watching the number of nights out and how they fit into your week. So, being aware that if you're out too many nights regularly, that is a recipe for poor sleep, spiral down. Too many nights in a row. So I try and only do 2 nights in a row and take a break. That's just a little thing. Fridays for us is a important thing, though we're not so hard on it that we've never broken the Friday rule. But nonetheless, we have fought hard over the years to keep Fridays as our day off. We're a 6-day working family, so we tend to work Saturdays and Sundays as well as, and only Fridays off. But the nature of Friday, one of the things we learnt very early on was if you haven't as a couple worked out how you're going to spend your Friday as a pattern, you'll argue every Friday. Because you come to the Friday tense and tired and stressed, and negotiating together what you both want to do is actually quite a tricky thing to do. So we worked out over the years, now it's best to wake up on Friday and already know what we're going to do. And we have a pattern, and it's got to do with the S's, the surf and the sand and others. And so we just have a regular thing that we wake up and there's refreshment in that pattern. Holidays for us are very important. So I've got one in a week's time and I'm on the way down to it. So
making a priority for holidays, planning that early,
helpful. 2 other things. The planning your holidays at the beginning of the year so that you can get a rhythm towards it, not just going along and saying, I need a holiday, have one now.
Yeah.
Working out your week program proactively where you plan what you do each day so there becomes a growing rhythm to it as well. I was hugely helped by that proactive weekly planner. And I was able to finish each day knowing that tomorrow I'd booked in the things I needed to do to get the outcomes I was after. And so I could finish the day going, rest. I saw recently someone was saying that they're finishing their week with things left undone and they were okay about that. And I got the sentiment. I understood the sentiment. But I think, no, if we're a little bit more proactive in our weekly planning, we can get to the end of the week and say, often, not always, and I think this man was right, not always, but often I can get to the end of the week and say, I've done the things I needed to do this week. And then you can rest. The rest of the labour, you can just go, I've done it.
And I think we addressed that well in the development program of connecting those key outcomes. What's your purpose in ministry, disciple making, maturing the saints, but connecting that down into your diary.
Yes.
So that it's not, your diary isn't run by everything that turns up,
yes,
but quite clear intentionality about how you'll spend your time so that on your day of rest might not mean that everything got done, but you're clear about the important things.
Yeah, exactly right. And so there's a getting out of the 7-day cycle. So development program picks all this up, the being proactive, getting above, getting on top of it. And not just working through a to-do list. I think one of the dangers I just keep adding things into a to-do list and think when I've got a spare moment, I'll work my way through that. And that fails to give you space to be creative and do box 2 strategic stuff. And so working on the weekly program's been important too.
Yeah.
I want to push into though you're purposeful about creating attention for the pastor. You use words. Well, at one stage, you use words. You want a pastor to be emotionally bound up, in these priorities and these things. You want them to see there's something great at stake. You're happy to be awake at night.
No, I hate it.
So just talk, like, that's the pressure that you live with, because you can, you want to be able to say, like Paul, now I live, that you stand firm. Now I live, that you are mature. It tires you out, surely, tuckers you out. You go, hey, I'm done. I want to go on. I want to go on the beach.
Yeah, totally. We early on with our church. We had a number of people come to us, transfer from a couple of other churches, and they reflected on the surprise and shock it was to see their pastors work hard. They said that they'd seen lots of pastoral ministry where golf was a big thing, and he would get up without a sermon really prepared because and so they were quite surprised, and it was hugely helpful for them. I want us to be captivated in a way that means we model a life that is consumed by the cause of the gospel. And it is costly, and some people are gifted to bear that cost more than others. So this is going back to knowing yourself. And perhaps I have a higher capacity. I know some on our team who do. So there are some men and women amongst us who they can just work, and they're still vibrant and energised. And I look at them and I just go, I can't do what you do.
Can't keep up.
And that's okay. But I want to push myself to do a little bit more. And as these young women were reflecting, learning yourself how much to push, when to push, and so on.
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about missionary service, and in some ways it sounds like you're talking about pastors as missionaries with a missionary lifestyle in many ways, but also wanting to raise up a generation or more of missionaries in their congregations, of people who are similarly passionate about the gospel, who see it as an all-of-life thing, who aren't concerned about just one role.
Yeah, no, I'm just smiling a little bit here because isn't that exactly what it should be?
Yeah.
You're exactly right. It's and as you've lived the missionary lifestyle, there's a sense in when you go overseas, it's much easier to conceive of my life as focused around this whole purpose. This is why we're here. And absolutely, the calling to pastoral ministry, however you conceive of that, is to be a local missionary. The reason I've come to the Central Coast is to see the region won for Christ, people formed in Christ and so on. I'm not here to enjoy the beaches, though they're lovely. But he's made all good things to enjoy, and Sabbath, rest, and so on and so forth. And so, 100% agree. Raise up missionaries, raise up people who think more intentionally. Do you know, what I'm looking for is someone whose week is centred around the things of Christ, and so the gathering of Christ's people, and the rest of their week is living out the overflow of that experience, and looking forward again to that experience as the pinnacle of their gathering again with God's people. But too often it's the last thing that goes in the diary. Too often it's the if I can fit it in, if I've got nothing, and you go, there's a measure. There's something there that needs to change.
Yeah. One of the things you do very helpfully in the book, in I think it's chapter 6, is address older and younger leaders differently in terms of dangers of a passion for growth and the need for that. Any thoughts particularly on different generations, people starting off in ministry, people who've been doing ministry for the long term, things to look out for?
Yeah, there are differences in the ages we're at. So my life is very different now that we're empty nesters. I early on with young kids, your Saturday needed to be paying attention to this small church that I have, in a sense, this small family that I'm given responsibility to love and nurture and enjoy. And so I've recognised that. There's mothers, particularly women, if they're going to go into marriage and have kids, very different seasons of life. I'm telling you, Joe, you know what you know. And so you can't be what you are as an empty nester back when it's irresponsible. But two, there's other dimensions that come into that. I think there's a freshness and an energy and a romanticism that can come in when you're younger. And one of the great things about our ministry training pipeline for generations has been you get to do those first few years with an older man and woman, and you see what it looks like to have worked through the heat of the day and how to develop patterns that are sustainable and healthy. Because you do come out with a romantic idealism about the changes I'm going to make, how it's going to be this and that. I've grown up, I've been in churches and I've watched what's happened, and why wouldn't a leader do this? How come they don't do this? And when I'm there, but it's always much more complex. So the younger leader needs to recognise there's edges to knock off, there's the heat of the day, there's the challenges of compromise, all of these things they need to pay attention to. The older leader, though, you just get tired. And you get tired, especially in a context where you've not seen much fruit. You've worked through the heat of the day. You've been labouring faithfully. And what can then happen is your ambitions close in and get smaller. And so the older minister needs to be open to the possibility there's more that could be done. Patterns might need to be changed. Repentance might need to be had to see something of what God might do in the future. I remember one older pastor said to me some years ago, he said, I have gotten into ruts, I've gotten into patterns, and I need a shot in the arm. I need a group of people around me to lift my vision and get me going again. And actually that's Reach Australia. That's what we're wanting to do with Reach Australia.
Yeah. At the start of your book, you talk about some of the pain that comes with change and talking about hard truths, and change is never painless. Any thoughts on the pain of change? Anything that you've seen for yourself? Tell us whether it's worth it.
Oh, well, yeah, it's always worth it. It's very much worth it. Yeah. We're only here a few years. What the heck? I mean, this is the brevity of life thing. There's an overly self-protective ministry is just not worth it. You will be here for 60, 70, 80 years and gone. Some of the most influential, impactful ministers, they died early. So we're not here long. It's worth it. But I've found, so sort of personal testimony, every 2 or 3 years in the first 15 years of church life, I had to go through dramatic changes to keep freeing up the work for it to grow. It was just evident that if I didn't step back, if I didn't give away, if I didn't let others, I would become an impediment to the growth of the ministry. But to step back was to reinvent myself to some degree, and there was grief involved in that. And I think one of the things that became very clear to me early on was that change brought with it grief. I could no longer be what I was, and I loved that. There was something about those things that I wanted and enjoyed, and so a lot of grief has been part of the change journey. And so it was helpful for me actually to identify that in my own life, because it gave a way to process it more readily. To actually accept the grief, own it, feel the pain of it, not pretend otherwise, live it, let it out, give it to God. And give clear reasons why I'd embrace the loss and grief. Other change creates conflict. So some changes have occurred in the context of having to say no to people. And that triggers for you how much you're in it to please people or please your Father. And they're great blessings. So it's interesting, the pain of the change has been costly, of course, but even in those painful changes, there's been growth in my own discipleship. So, I mean, there's a part of me, the kitchen's hot, do you know what I mean? When you're cooking the kitchen, it's going to be hot. And if you can't cope with the heat, but the heat's good for you. So there's the beautiful thing. You're actually stepping into a context that is like Jesus. It's following in his footsteps, do you know? And it forces you to do self-reflection work out what bits are actually the flesh and what are the spirit, and how can I cull and cut and grow. But after all that process, you just become more and more what God intends you to be. It's a beautiful thing, even just for my sake. Christian ministry is actually a blessing for the pastor and their family, actually, too. It's interesting with adult children. One of my daughters said the other day that, she was asked about, did you resent the fact that your parents were busy and so on and so forth? She said, yes, there's a sense in which I hated that they weren't just there and what have you. But she said, I grew to realise they were about important things. And that was also a blessing to be part of and engage with. Yeah, you've got all that.
Well, thanks, Andrew. This has been really helpful. Thank you for sharing so honestly about some of the challenges of pastoral ministry today. We're continuing our conversation with Andrew about his new book, Growth and Change. If you haven't heard our earlier interviews, I encourage you to go back there. Our next episode will be on 5 key foundations for ministry.